A policeman was gravely injured while chasing down a car full of perpetrators. Eventually, he had a severe seizure and the doctor was about to declare him dead. But then the dog noticed something odd and stopped him. What happened next is a display of loyalty unlike anything you've ever seen. Sergeant Kevin Fount leaned hard on the steering wheel of the Crown Victoria. His blues were on and the siren was blaring. He had been on the tail of these perpetrators for almost 15 minutes. They dodged him in the center of town, but now that they'd made their way to the interstate where there was less chance of hurting innocent bystanders, the playing field was level. He had the SUV ahead of him, and then glanced briefly in the rearview mirror at Vixen on the back seat. The Belgian Malinois was sitting straight up, his ears perked and his intelligent eyes following the chase. Suddenly, the perpetrator's SUV veered hard left. It shot ahead and then stopped on the shoulder of the road, all four doors opened. The criminals piled from the vehicle like rats abandoning a ship and scuttled into the woods lining the interstate. Kevin looked Vixen dead in the eyes and said, "You stay here for now, boy." Then he jumped from the police cruiser, drew his weapon, and headed for the spot where the perpetrators had entered the woods. They were somewhere in the trees, but Kevin could neither hear nor see any sign of them. Cautiously, he edged deeper into the woods. He crabbed sideways to cover every angle, his firearm raised, and all his senses on high alert. When the blow came, his world suddenly turned into a slow-motion event. As he fell to the ground, Kevin knew he'd been ambushed. He understood that he'd been hit on the back of the head with something heavy, and that he was in the process of losing consciousness. The last thing Kevin did before everything went black was activate the button that would open the car door and release Vixen from the car. When the door opened, Vixen shot into action like a streak of lightning. His nose told him exactly where to go. In the distance, between the trees, he saw Kevin motionless on the ground with a large man sitting on his stomach. The man had a huge knife in his hands. He lifted it, preparing to stab Kevin. Vixen doubled his pace and flew into the air. He tackled the criminal with his full body weight and momentum and sent the man flying. The criminal scrambled to his feet and swore under his breath, said something about killing both Kevin and Vixen, then he charged. In his one hand, he held the 2x4 he'd scooped up, and the other was the knife. Vixen met him halfway. The dog tucked under a wild swing of the 2x4, side-stamped an even wilder slash of the knife, and then grabbed the guy's arm a few inches below the elbow. The criminal bellowed like a wounded bull and tried to shake Vixen off, but the dog shook back, using his powerful neck muscles to tighten his grip. Eventually, the criminal went down on one knee. He dropped the 2x4 and started stabbing at Vixen with the knife, but the dog kept ducking out of the way. In the process, he had to let go of the perpetrator's arm. The man used the opportunity to scramble upright and then ran into the woods. Vixen swiveled around and ran straight over to Kevin. He sensed his friend wasn't in a good state, and he was the priority. Behind him, Vixen heard voices. With his nose still picking up all the scents around him, he ran in the direction of the sounds. It was a second police vehicle that had been following the car chase on the radio and had come in to assist. The two officers recognized Vixen from the precinct and followed him to Kevin. He was unconscious when they found him, and in a worrying state. Once they got to the hospital, things weren't looking good. Doctors ordered a battery of tests and immediately started working on Kevin. Vixen went home with one of the other officers, but he was up all night. He paced and whined, and then paced some more. When morning came, he was already waiting by the car when Kevin's colleague came out of the house. Vixen had only one thing on his mind. He had to get to Kevin as quickly as possible. There was no telling if his friend needed him. At the hospital, the doctor shared the troubling news. Kevin had suffered a severe skull fracture from the blow to the back of his head, and there was bleeding in his brain, too. He was in a coma, and only time would tell if he would ever get better. They hadn't allowed Vixen into the ICU, and he was left lying by the front door of the emergency room. When Kevin's fellow officer came out again, Vixen looked around anxiously for Kevin, but he was nowhere to be seen. He tilted his head and looked at Kevin's colleague as if to say, "Where's Kevin?" The officer shook his head and opened the door of the patrol car for Vixen to slip into the back seat. Vixen followed with his tail down. It was as if he could sense what was going on. 3 months later, the decision was made to send Kevin home. He was still in a coma. Everybody hoped being in familiar surroundings would help wake him up. Arrangements had been made for around-the-clock care, and the whole precinct was there to escort the ambulance to Kevin and Vixen's home. Vixen found a spot next to Kevin's bed and stayed with him day in and day out. It was on a Thursday morning around 5 o'clock that Vixen first noticed something was different. The dog wasn't sure exactly what it was, but something was going on with Kevin. He flew out of the room and scratched at the door where Kevin's caregiver slept. She woke up from the commotion and shuffled after Vixen to Kevin's bedroom. The sight that greeted them brought tears to her eyes. Kevin's eyes were open, and they were focused. He looked at Vixen first. "Hello, boy," he said. His arm was weak, almost limp, but he held down an arm to stroke the dog's head. For the next few months, Kevin's recovery was slow and arduous. He was struggling to walk. Months of lying on his back had caused his muscles to atrophy, and it would take many months of physiotherapy before he would be up and about again. Then the unthinkable happened. One night, Kevin tried to get out of bed to go to the bathroom. Vixen was immediately awake and ready to follow him, but the sensitive dog noticed something strange was happening. It wasn't necessarily a smell, and it certainly wasn't a sound. It was more like something in the air that set his senses on high alert. Vixen tilted his head and looked carefully at Kevin. His friend was on his feet now, but still very unstable. The next moment, Kevin's face contorted into a pained expression. He clenched his jaw and his eyes seemed to bulge out of his face. Vixen streaked down the passage to the caregiver's bedroom. He scratched, barked, and snarled until he could hear movement inside the room and then ran back down the hall to Kevin's bedroom. By now, Kevin had fallen. His body was still convulsing and a thin layer of foam covered the corners of his mouth. The caregiver came into the room and took over. She spoke softly to Kevin, placing a pillow under his head to support his neck, and gently rolled him onto his side. She checked his pulse and listened for breathing. Then she phoned the doctor. When the physician arrived, he examined Kevin and then shook his head. He turned and spoke urgently to the caregiver. There was general sadness in the room. They were talking and acting as if Kevin was dead. Vixen had seen this many times during his service. People acted like this when people had died, but Vixen couldn't understand it. Not at all. The doctor seemed to think Kevin was dead, but Vixen knew he was not. When they brought a stretcher up to remove Kevin's limp figure, Vixen went into full combat mode. He stood over Kevin with 2 legs on either side. Then he pulled his lips back to expose his teeth, and he growled menacingly. Every time somebody tried to come closer, the growl turned into a snarl, and when they backed off, it settled into an ominous growl again. This went on for more than an hour. Then, a second hour passed. The doctor had phoned the police department. He wanted them to send somebody over to pick up the dog so they could remove Kevin's body. The captain himself arrived on the scene. When he saw Vixen standing over Kevin's lifeless shape, he looked down at his feet. He told the doctor this was not going to be as easy as it seemed. Kevin and Vixen had been comrades for 7 years. They had a virtually unbreakable bond. Vixen watched all of this play out in front of him. Somehow, he had to get them to understand that they were wrong. Kevin wasn't dead. He could feel it. The doctor told the captain that Kevin had no heartbeat and wasn't breathing. No amount of CPR would bring him back now. But while he was speaking, Kevin started coughing. Vixen stood to the side but still kept a beady eye on the doctor and the captain. The next morning, the doctor was on television, telling the nation that he had witnessed a rarity called the Lazarus effect. Kevin had seemed dead, but it was just a result of a severe epileptic seizure, which had happened because of his head injury. It might have taken the doctor a cough to understand, but the dog had known Kevin was alive all along. Kevin recovered with his faithful companion by his side. He knew Vixen would always have his back. What a great story about bravery and camaraderie between a man and a dog. Have you ever had contact with a police dog? Tell us your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more.